This is my speaking outline. Today you are having a family cookout at your waterfront home. You can't wait, so you head to the local seafood market to get some food. While you're shopping around, you wonder, where does all this seafood come from? Meanwhile, there are tons of boats out on the murky water. Commercial crabbers, fishermen, and are out there working to earn some money. After a long, hard day on the bay, they sell what they caught to the local seafood markets. What bay did all this seafood come from, you may ask? The Chesapeake Bay, of course. Today I will be informing you on the Chesapeake Bay, on the history of the Chesapeake Bay, along with how it was formed, the Oyster Wars, and along with the landmarks along the bay. The Chesapeake Bay was formed by two natural disasters. The first was a comet or asteroid-like object that hit the Earth in an area that is the lower tip of the Delmarva Peninsula in Virginia. That is this section right here. The Chesapeake Bay program also says that 18,000 years ago, the glaciers started to melt as a result of the greenhouse effect. This effect caused the Susquehanna River to flood. When the Susquehanna River flooded, this kept the sea level rising. That formed what we now know as the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay was presumed its shape 3,000 years ago. The Oyster Wars are also a big history of the Chesapeake Bay. Life in the Chesapeake Bay by Alice and Robert Lipson says that oyster bars are in the mid and lower section of the Chesapeake Bay. The oyster bars are very diverse and have many different creatures living on them in the old oyster shells that are empty. This picture shows that there are many other species living on the oyster shells. There are species such as mud crabs, barnacles, and sea anemones, all in there. Many of these people do this because they can lay their eggs and larvae on the oyster shells. So because none of the bars are spotted by the Chesapeake Bay visitors. The Oyster Wars of the Chesapeake Bay by John R. Winterstead also says that an English visitor once said, "A boat and a pair of wooden tongs, wide at the end and tipped with iron, is how you would catch an oyster." As you know, if a visitor of the Chesapeake Bay would say this, then anybody could catch oysters. Of course, Maryland had their laws of oyster catching, but Virginia did not. So many people would come up the Chesapeake Bay and come into Maryland's territory and capture their oysters without thinking about the laws, because in Virginia they didn't have those laws. They over-harvested in Maryland, and now we're dealing with it. We used to have oyster police up and down the Chesapeake Bay trying to stop people that are over-harvesting the oysters. The same book also says that Maryland was an advertised seller of oysters. This is an old-time advertisement that I got out of that book that is from Baltimore. It's actually a restaurant that was in the Baltimore Harbor at the time. The Oyster Wars of the Chesapeake Bay continues by talking about dredging for crabs, oysters, and fish. Dredging is taking a large tail and pulling mud and dirt into it to capture all the seafood at the bottom of the bay. They would capture oysters, crabs, fish, shrimp, anything you could think of. We still do this today, but instead of catching the animals, we actually take the dredge and add it to other islands that are disappearing. The Chesapeake Bay Office, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, says that even though oysters are resilient, they are not immune to the pressures of disease, overharvesting, and pollution. Now that even though oyster overharvesting was a problem back then, it continues to be a problem now. Now, the Chesapeake Bay Office of National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is continuing to try and up the population of of oysters due to the overharvesting that occurred back in the day. Now that we have talked about the oyster wars, we will continue by talking about the historical aspects along Chesapeake Bay. The Baltimore Harbor is one of the largest because that is where the oyster wars actually occurred. Though not all of the oyster wars occurred there, some of them did. And the Chesapeake Bay, the harbor is actually now, there are no oysters there anymore. Smith Island is the next. This is Smith Island in 1849, and this is Smith Island now. Smith Island was discovered by a man named John Smith, who actually went out on the Chesapeake Bay and discovered Smith Island, obviously. He was out there with 15 men, and he was on the Chesapeake Bay for 3 to 4 weeks. He discovered this island, and in the past 150 years, it has lost 277 acres of land. I found this information from The Disappearing Islands of the Chesapeake by William B. Cronin. The acreage of the island in 1849 was 9,776. Now the acreage is 9,499 acres. The last historical aspect that does not tie in with the oysters is Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry is a very big deal to our country because this is where our Star-Spangled Banner was written. Though it doesn't tie in with the oysters, it's where our national anthem became true. And it is also located on the Chesapeake Bay. I hope you now understand how the Chesapeake Bay was formed and how the oyster wars were, and visit some of the historical aspects of the Chesapeake Bay. With this knowledge, I hope you will look into help save the oysters of the Chesapeake Bay, along with visiting some of the historical aspects that you can see. Sylvia Earle once said, 10% of the big fish still remain. There are still some blue whales. There are some krill in Antarctic. There are a few oysters in the Chesapeake Bay. Half of the coral reefs are still in pretty good shape, a jewel belt around the middle of the planet. There's big time, but not a lot, to turn things around. Let's help out and take care of our bay.